to this episode of The Disputed Question. I'm Christopher Perrin, and I am uh, glad to be here with some really thoughtful and enjoyable and even humorous people. Not everyone on this call is humorous. Most of them are. And we're just so glad that you're joining us. And if you're seeing this as a recording later, we hope that whatever is going to come now in the future will be enjoyable to you who exist in the past. But we're going to be discussing virtue and is it the chief end of education? And everyone that you see here on the call has written a short essay addressing that question. And I have read through them and marked them up. They're interesting, and there's some interesting overlapping themes. But there's not complete agreement. There's some kind of divergent views. There's some nuance. So I hope we can talk about that as well. But before we get started, we just want to recognize you who are on the call. If you wouldn't mind just going into the chat box and telling us where you're from and what your relationship to education is. Maybe you're just someone who is an ongoing learner. That'd be great. Maybe you're a teacher. Maybe you're a student of some kind. Maybe you're an administrator. Maybe you're a writer. But tell us who you are, where you're from, and what your relationship to education is. And I'll allow our panelists to do the same thing. Maybe say something about your particular, tell us about your origin story. When did you first decide to be a teacher, Lou Marcos? I'd like to hear how that happened. Okay, so just looking, this is the fun part. We've got some folks from Texas, Kansas City, someone with the Great Hearts Network, someone from Hillsdale, a student at Hillsdale College, director of curriculum at Kendale Schools in Arizona. There is David Goodwin, president of ACCS. And if you don't know what those four letters stand for, you will soon learn. Diane from Richmond, classroom teacher, parent, homeschool educator, homeschool mom of 7. Great. April McBride, someone who's just finished his or her undergrad. Stephen has finished his undergraduate degree at Baylor in philosophy. Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call tonight. If you have a question, you are welcome to put it into the Q&A box there. Okay, so anytime you have a question that you want the panels to answer, put it in that Q&A box. Now, if you want to make comments in the chat box as we're going, you are welcome to do that too. We do not conduct this class like we do the classes we teach at college and school, where we prohibit people from chatting while we're lecturing. But in this case, we do allow for a little commentary, and even the panelists might divert their attention and respond to something in the chat. We just do it that way in this particular genre because yes, we can multitask at times. But for your formal question, if you want to make sure that we answer a question you have, please put it in the Q&A box. And after about, maybe 40 minutes of our conversation that you'll be listening in on, we'll pivot and we'll turn it over to you for questions. Okay, we can go for up to 90 minutes tonight, but we certainly will not go beyond 90 minutes. And some of you have children to put to bed and dinners to make and other things, and you may have to pop off the call. That's totally fine. We'll send you a link with the recording so you can watch the entire conversation tonight. Okay, is that clear enough? We're going to have a conversation together, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So thank you, panelists, each of you for the essay you wrote. What we'll do now is a quick introduction, and I will hold you to being quick because, look how much time I'm taking. I'm taking too much time already. And, when you get the mic, you're going to want to do the same thing. But if you would, keep it brief, just maybe 30 or 40 seconds. Tell us who you work for, what organization you work for, and what it is that you do for that organization. And share maybe another bit or two about something you're doing. That would be fine. But let's keep it quick. And then I'll begin with our opening question. So we'll go in this order. We'll go to Andrew Kern, then Christine Perrin, then David Goodwin, then Carrie, then David, then Ravi, then Gary, then Lou, and then Martin. Andrew, who are you?
Good guess. I'm Andrew Kern. I'm with the Circe Institute. I'm a grandfather. I just had my 12th grandson about a month ago. And so I'm, as happy as can be. That's it.
Thank you, Andrew. What have you written recently?
I wrote an article for this.
What about a published book?
Oh, I wrote Unless the Lord Builds the House, the shared foundations for education.
Excellent. If you have a copy of that, you can wave it at us. And if you wouldn't mind, there he's gone.
Looking for my copy.
Well, put a link in the chat box
Oh,
so people can find it.
okay. Thanks.
Christine Perrin, who are you? Oh, you're muted, Christine.
I teach for the Honors College at Messiah University, and I've taught at Messiah for over 20 years. And I first started thinking about teaching when I was in college at Johns Hopkins. I went down the road to a high school and I asked a teacher, could I just come and share what I'm learning? And she gave me a slot once a week with her students. And I found it really vital to share the things that I was acquiring with others.
And you continue to do that around the house, I might add. Have you written anything in the last few years?
I just have finished a second book of poetry called Dark Gospel, Figure of Descent, and I'm haven't sent it around yet, but that's what I've most recently written.
Are you looking for a publisher? Yeah. Yes, a publisher of poetry. Thank you, Christine. And yes, there's a relationship. Christine and I are brother and sister in Christ. And we're also married.
Isn't that what Abraham said? Yeah.
That's right. Not once, but twice. David, who are you? David Goodwin.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm David Goodwin with Association of Classical Christian Schools. Chris, thanks a lot for hosting this program. I got my start about 25 years ago in classical Christian education. And the first project we had was to find a lead at what at the time was Foundations Academy. And we hired Andrew Kern, who spent the next 5 years trying to get me to figure out what classical ed was. And I don't know if I ever got it, but I ended up in administration at that school and then eventually heading the ACCS. My books come very slowly. So the last one was Battle for the American Mind. And the next one's called Forging the American Mind. It'll be out next school year sometime.
Excellent. Look forward to that very much. Thank you, David. Carrie, who are you?
That's an existential question. That will take too long. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm Carrie Eben, and I'm a mom, and I became a teacher because I loved learning. I couldn't decide on a major, actually, and I really wanted to teach everything. So I became a 5th grade teacher. But I'm an education consultant, founded a classical school here. I homeschooled for 12 years. I've been a part of the classical education movement for over 25. I am an adjunct professor in humanities at John Brown University, and I'm a new Circe head mentor for their apprenticeship. I'm very excited to start that this summer.
Fantastic. And, Carrie and I are pretty excited. We did work on a book together. It's this one called The Good Teacher. So
thank you. I don't even have it yet, so I have nothing to show you. It's stuck in Tulsa.
I'm sorry about that. It's been a joy working with Carrie over the last year and a half or so. David, how about you? Who are you?
Hi, David Diener here. I'm a education professor at Hillsdale College and also the executive director of the Alcuin Fellowship. So here at Hillsdale, we have undergraduate and graduate programs in classical education, and then our work with the Alcuin Fellowship, which involves a number of the other folks on this call as well. We're a a nonprofit think tank that provides intellectual leadership for the classical Christian education renewal. And I got into classical education through homeschooling, actually. We were doing classical Christian ed with our own kids while I was in grad school. And that, through a series of events, led me to work in classical Christian schools. I was in K-12 for 15 years, ended up being the headmaster of 2 different schools before moving back into higher education full-time. So that's my story of how I got involved first through my wife, and then started reading about things and have been involved in a number of ways. You're muted, Chris.
Thank you. David's written a book on Plato, the great philosopher educator as well. Ravi, who are you?
Well, picking up on David's theme, I'm an Alcuin Fellow, and I got to know Chris and David about 15 years ago through the fellowship, along with some others. And am assistant professor of philosophy and liberal studies at the Templeton Honors College, Eastern University, where I'm also the co-director of the Master of Arts in Teaching and Classical Education, along with Brian Williams, another Alcuin Fellow. And I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Some of you might know Ravi co-authored the book, The Liberal Arts Tradition, with Kevin Clark as well. Thank you, Ravi, for being here. Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Hardenberg. I'm the director of the Honors College at Houston Christian University, a colleague there with Lou Marcos, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy. Yeah, and my oldest daughter just graduated from high school, so I've got lots of feelings right now. You know, those of you who've been there before, yeah, and it's a good time.
Thank you, Gary, for joining us. And Gary has studied a good bit of ancient philosophy, and so his perspective is going to be very valuable tonight. Lou, who are you?
My name's Lou Marcos. I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, where I've been teaching for 34 years. I did a book called The Myth Made Fact with Classical Academic Press, and I love doing it. And it looks like we're going to do a book on Dante as well, so that's exciting. But the book that I'm really excited about is the new one, Passing the Torch, an apology for classical Christian education. And my essay is actually an excerpt from this book. More exciting, just about a week ago, I spent the week in Boise, Idaho, with David Goodwin over there, and filmed 12 lectures on ancient Greek and Roman paideia for this incredible series. And it's the first time I ever used a teleprompter. And I got to tell you something else. It's not really about me, but St. Austin Review is having me review this book, Christian Paideia, and it's really, really good so far. So I'd already endorse it. Very good.
Fantastic. Lou's always writing. I lost track of Lou's books, but thank you, Lou, for the last book. I can't wait to read it. And Gary also has written a book on Aristotle as well, as one of the great educator thinkers from the past. Martin, who are you?
I'm a co-founder of Memoria Press and Highlands Latin School in Louisville, Kentucky. And my latest project is Memoria College, where we offer a Master of Arts degree in the great books. And we actually gave Lou our Parnassus Prize for Literature, was it 2 years ago now, for From Plato to Christ, the book From Plato to Christ. And I almost regret giving, I was going to call him and say, Lou, we're going to pull your prize because we now want to give it to Passing the Torch, because that's even better. Really, if you have not read Passing the Torch, it may be the best book on classical education I've ever read. It's really, really good. So if you haven't read it, read it. Yeah, and so I mostly teach and write and do what Tanya Charlton at the office tells me to do, and that's a lot. And I am, as of today, a grandfather the 7th time over. A little girl, Lucy.
Congrats.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. And those of you who are on the call, I think you will enjoy now the conversation that we're going to have. It is about virtue. You probably have heard somewhere along the line that virtue is really important in the classical education tradition. Andrew Kern's on the call. He's been talking about this for a long time. In fact, if you look at the tagline for the Circe Institute, it is simply this: cultivating wisdom and virtue. And then those of us who over the years have been pulled in, and thank you, Andrew, for kind of lifting up that flag a long time ago. Those of us who've been reading the tradition have seen it, have seen what Andrew maybe saw before some of the others of us. That yes, this is a note that is sounded again and again, perhaps beginning with the Greek philosophers, but then you see it in the Old Testament. I mean, you see it in various ways. It seems to be human. It seems as if the law of God is written on our hearts such that we are inclined to want to be, even in our fallen state, like our Creator. That we know that we are supposed to be good. And so this is an ongoing, therefore, I think, an ongoing conversation and issue for human beings since the beginning. So that it is in the tradition, but is it the chief end of education? Could it be one important thing that we do, but does it merit the adjective chief? So I'll let that be our kind of opening question, your musings on that. Let's just stipulate that it's important that virtue is cultivated, but is it chief? And if you're going to address that question and say, yes, it is chief or it's not, could you also offer a brief definition of what it is? Because if it is chief, it's got to be because of its nature, seems to me. So what is it about virtue that would give it this rank?
Can I ask a clarifying question? When we wrote our essays, was the word chief in there?
I think it was in the prompt.
Well, now I have to try to defend it being the chief end, even though I'm not sure I believe that. I would offer this as a starting point on the question that a virtue is an excellence, and a human virtue is a human capacity made excellent. So if I have the capacity to walk, then the virtue of walking is walking really well. If I have the virtue to use language, the virtue is using language really well. If I have the virtue to think, if I have the faculty or ability to think, then the virtue of that would be thinking really well. Let's call it wisdom. So in that sense, virtue means that the person is really good at being the person. He's really good at being what he's made to be. I love to think of it this way, that when the Lord says your name, what does he mean by it? Right? When you are what the Lord means when he says your name, then you are a fully virtuous person. Okay, so in that sense, I think it's the goal of education. And I'm going to make this qualifier that in our definition at Circe, what we say is education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, but we end it by saying, so that in Christ, the student is better able to know, glorify, and enjoy God. So the chief end of all that we do is our union with God. But I'll make this qualifier, and I'm offering this as a way of framing it for challenge or discussion. I'm not offering this as a settlement to the question. It can be the chief end of education as education, and that's its distinctive thing. Whereas everything, the chief end is to glorify God, to be united with God. So then the distinctive way that we glorify God, and therefore the chief end, relatively speaking, if I can put it that way, of education is that we glorify God best when we are fully human. If I can read better, I can understand the Bible better. If I can lift more weights, I can serve better when lifting, like in Les Miserables, when the guy actually lifts up that super heavy thing. He's able to serve in a way that nobody else could do. He's more virtuous. If I have more courage, I can serve better, right? So I can do all the things I'm supposed to do as a human better if I have the virtues.
So
And that's the goal of education.
may I ask a clarifying question then? What is there a distinction between virtue and virtues? And what is that distinction?
Oh, that's a really good question.
A number of you mentioned and you kind of also started to list a kind of hierarchy. Ravi did this in his paper. He said that maybe there's also piety as something that it might be something that we seek and on the way to virtue. In other words, some of you saw pathways to virtue that might include other things, and seem to be other ways of using the terminology. Sometimes we talk about virtue in this as an abstract noun or some kind of all-inclusive noun, and then there's a lot of talk about particular virtues. Gary, I wonder, since you studied the virtue tradition from Aristotle a lot, I wonder, would you offer any kind of terminological guidance for us here?
I don't know. I mean, so because in particular in my essay, I took the Socratic line that virtue is knowledge, and that this is in some way at odds with, but just different from the Aristotelian line about virtue as sort of excellence of character or habit or something like that. But there is, in general, right? There's a sort of an understanding of what virtue, you might say, in the abstract is, and then we can have various lists of virtues that all sort of, I mean, so courage, right, is the virtue related to fear, for example, right? And generosity is the virtue related to giving and receiving money. And so it's the one virtue, sort of the idea of virtue applied to different fields of human life. So I think that's generally one way of making this distinction between the virtues, plural, and virtue sort of in general.
Seems like there are a lot of ways that a human being can become good. A lot of ways that a human being can be excellent or holy or realize the potential of our imageness. And a number of you touched upon this. And so maybe there's therefore Martin, you disappeared, but I see your hand. Could you turn on your camera? Oh, there you are. You just moved up there. So I'll segue to you since you raised your hand. But if there are a lot of ways that a human being can be good, maybe it makes sense that there would be a lot of different lists of virtues, different ways that humans are in the world. And I will just make this last comment. I loved, a couple of you made this comment that it's realizing humanity is one way of thinking about virtue. And in Brian's essay, he used the phrase human being in that sense, being a human. To actually be a human really, really well would involve lots of different ways of thinking about how we would be good. Martin, how can you help us?
Well, I don't know. But I do think that, what I tried to say in my essay was there's a sense of being virtuous, being a more excellent human being, a more excellent example of a man. And in fact, if you look at that word, virtue, the first three letters are the word for man. It literally would mean something like manliness. And I think that's the way Caesar uses it in the Gallic Wars. And I think that comports with that idea of excellence in being a human being, closer to what the essence of a human being is.
Now, some of you noted that if you can realize your potential as a human being, I think this is you, Martin, there's a kind of inward to outward movement where you realize your nature, you become what you are. And And then David Goodwin mentioned, well, there's a perspective in which virtue is conforming oneself to what is actually real, to become to know who you are really and conform to that. But also you seem to be thinking that maybe there's a reality outside of the human being or external that we also need to be in harmony with. And so I wonder if anybody on the call would want to address maybe this kind of dialectic between the outward in and the inward out, or the internal and external factors that might, or perspectives that might be at play in becoming a virtuous person. Because I resonate with both of those comments. To become virtuous is to realize who you are, to become what you are. And yet it's to conform to something that is real.
I would love to jump in. After reading Andrew's essay, I just love what he said. It's virtue is not necessarily the things that you do or that you practice, but it's part of it. It's also, I think, primarily, as we've been saying, it is who you are. It's a human being living out their full purpose in who they were created to be, their telos. What were they created to be? What does that look like? How did God create them to be? But there's also, the way, like you said, the movement. There has to be a movement in the soul to kind of move towards virtue, to move in goodness, and to kind of, I would say, to reflect on that and to incline towards the good. And doing that I would say that's the practice of virtue, where we're practicing skills. And so I think that's where maybe some of the different types of virtue come in, where you have, physical virtues, you have specific intellectual virtues, of course, you have spiritual virtues and moral virtues. There's a whole taxonomy, but all of those things, I think, lead up to who how we are the best that we can be as a human, and how we are created in God. So it's kind of a whole encompassing part, and then there's particulars in order to achieve that. But I can't remember who it was who wrote about piety. I can't remember.
Ravi.
But Ravi, I loved how Ravi wove piety in, because you have to be enchanted by the things that are worth inclining towards. You have to love them. And so that's part of the conversation too. So I loved reading all of the intricate parts of everyone's essay and just hearing the different nuance of this. It gave me a much fuller picture of virtue.
Let's go to Ravi to let him respond to that, maybe unpack the piety part, but let me also just forecast a couple of thoughts for future discussion. One is, of course, what does this have to do with students and what we do as educators? We need to come back to that, because we're thinking about virtue in education, in schools, and homeschooling and tutoring. Another is the relationship between the theological and the natural. Christine touched on this, but so did Brian and others. Christine argues in her essay that there's a sense in which virtues can become a problem, and that they fall short of Christ's teaching of Beatitude, and that there's something mysterious about blessedness that seems to transcend the kind of, classical Greek categories of virtue. Andrew says something similar. He talks a lot about blessedness as a kind of key concept for what it means to be human in a Christian economy. So I want to make sure we go there too, but let's go to you, Ravi. You were the one who brought up piety. Why did you think piety was necessary to bring up in a conversation about virtue?
Well, you make a great point in Christine's essay and Andrew's essay and others of yours essays, address the idea of blessedness. And so Makarios is the Greek word used there, or translated as beatus. So we get the Beatitudes for blessed. And that Greek word Makarios is got a similar semantic range to eudaimonia. In Attic Greek, when Plato and Aristotle are writing around the 4th century BC or so, they use eudaimonia, but Makarios, in the time of Koine Greek, has a similar semantic range: happiness, a blessedness, and so they seem to represent a very similar concept of the flourishing that comes, the joy that comes when we do the purpose for which we are fit for, when we do the right thing for the when we do the right thing, we find a joy in it, as I think is what Socrates and Plato and Aristotle are after in that. But the question about what's the right thing, although Socrates gets at it, I think, in lots of almost very, I mean, very peculiarly accurate ways, it really doesn't come clear until um, outside of Revelation, where we see that it's in our relationship with God and our ordering towards God and our relationship with Christ where our calling is really fulfilled. For what does it mean to do the right thing? It means to know and love God. And I think you're right about Andrew Kern. I think I did hear Andrew years ago talking a lot about virtue, and I was not an early adopter for the word virtue because it felt way too Greek to me. And for me, part of the reconciliation of coming to Andrew's perspective that virtue is a chief end of education is that this digging deeply into the Christian tradition and realizing that Augustine and Aquinas all struggled with this issue of Greek notions of virtue and Christian and what is the true calling of the Christian. And they, a lot of this reconciliation that we think of Augustine and Aquinas doing with classical culture is right around this issue of virtue. And but they say the reason why I was won over is because they put piety at the center. It's the mother of the virtues. Piety, your disposition towards God and your relationship with God, ultimately through the grace of Christ, is what allows us to be virtuous. And so, Aquinas talks about this twofold beatitude, where yes, there's a kind of flourishing that we experience that Plato and Cicero can talk about, but the real flourishing is the beatitude that you were asking about, Chris. The blessedness that comes from knowing God that Christine was talking about in her essay, Andrew talks about, and others, I think maybe David Goodwin, that there's the blessedness of knowing God. So I see I was won over to the virtue tradition when I realized that the Christians really kind of affirmed it, but took it further and said it's through knowing Christ that we're fully vir, as Andrew would say, fully humans, united with Christ, united with God.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
if I could jump in here, I think that was the genesis of what I was talking about. Andrew taught me early on that virtue is not a set of behaviors. It's a conformance. When Christ says to conform ourselves to Him, virtue is a conformance in all ways to our humanity as it was designed to be. And as Gary said earlier, Socrates, ties it to knowledge. And I think that's what I was trying to say in my essay, is that the reason education is tied to virtue so closely is that in our world of original sin and in our fallenness, the first project is to come to know rightly that which is real, the really real. In many respects, and of course there are realms of knowledge. Robbie, you talked about these in the great or in the liberal art tradition. There's realms of knowledge, realms of philosophy. Yes, there are realms of virtue, like there are realms of each of those. But what they really represent is the really real. And we live in a world that isn't real in many respects. As Augustine said, there's no evil has no part. It is not a real thing. And therefore, virtue is that which conforms to reality as the ideal and divine world would be. And that's what we pursue in education.
Yeah, I think you're doing a good job, therefore, of trying to link the internal and external perspectives on virtue. And David, you also cited a number of medieval thinkers. So you want to comment at all about what you've been learning as you've been reading the medieval tradition on this topic?
Well, I have to confess, for most people, if you know me, I have a master's in business. I'm not a scholar like most people on this call. So when it was first proposed to me, even for example, Anselm's axiom that I believe so that I may know, that went right over my head, and it took years for me to come to a place where I understood that. Without believing in Christ, without that sense of alignment with the really real, without that connection to Christ, you can't begin the project of knowing and understanding this world to come to wisdom in order that you might then come to conform to that wisdom. And they're two very different things. I think there are people who have more knowledge than they have virtue. I think they are perfectly willing to know, but not willing to conform. But I do think that first we must know, and that's what I meant, connecting Gary's statement about Socrates, that I think that Platonic influence in the early medievals with Anselm to begin with Christ, and then as we see the development of thought, you see Aquinas pick that up and adapt the knowledge of God to the queen of the sciences. That theology, that way in which we know God, is the precursor to every other form of knowledge that we can have. And so it forces a matter in the medieval mind, in order to have synthesis, in order to unite all knowledge under one perspective, under one truth, you have to begin with Christ and then synthesize everything else into a pool of knowledge that can be used to conform oneself to. It's difficult to conform oneself to something you don't know.
Then let's do this, see how this works out. There's a question that's been asked that goes this way. I'm just reading it. Some of our faculty are a bit resistant to virtues because why not the fruit of the Spirit? Virtues are humanistic. Shouldn't our focus be on becoming Christ-like? And shouldn't we be yielding to the work of the Holy Spirit? Addressing it, but wondering if you face these questions and how you encourage them. Because David's just been commenting about kind of the primacy of Christ when it comes to virtue. After the incarnation, things do change. But Ravi, you cited that even in Cicero and others, there's a tradition of talking about virtue that Christians did not reject. So I see you nodding your head, David Diener. How do you synthesize these two matters? Because why not just go with Galatians 5:22 and not even bother reading the Greeks?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Excuse me. First of all, I mean, as you were reading the question, my response was yes, yes, yes. In other words, what we're talking about with virtue in no way is a rejection of any of those things that were mentioned, the fruit of the Spirit, etc. But I think what's lurking in the question or in perhaps faculty's minds who have this concern is a kind of complete false dichotomy. So, and I would just say, as Ravi mentioned, look back to the early Christian thinkers. Excuse me. Look back to the church fathers and the early Christian thinkers, and then on throughout the centuries, as they incorporated or appropriated from this tradition that they had inherited, that talks in terms of virtue, arete, they talk about that in explicitly Christian terms. So I would be very wary of a notion that somehow the idea of virtue as the chief end of education is somehow the classical piece, and then we have this other Christian thing, the tradition of classical Christian education as it came about happened because Christians were reading these earlier sources and were interpreting them in light of Christ. So to say that somebody is this is why people like Aquinas or Joseph Pieper talk about virtue in terms of ultimately the beatific vision, right? Ultimately becoming what you were designed to be, fulfilling your function as a human being excellently is giving glory to God. So this is not an either or. There are different traditions that throughout the centuries came together, but I would be very, very hesitant when I'm addressing faculty who have a concern like this or parents. The first stage is, I think, to clarify what we mean by virtue, as we've been doing, and also just to be very careful that we're not dealing with a false dichotomy here, right? I mean, I'm also thinking of, to tie back to what David Goodwin said, Augustine defines virtue as the ordo amoris, or the ordering of loves. So the idea is you should give the proper affection to things, to each thing in reality that it deserves. That means both having knowledge about reality, but also having your affections properly attuned, your heart properly attuned. And of course, C.S. Lewis picks up on this in The Abolition of Man as well. So to try to bifurcate between sort of Christian speak and virtue speak is, to my mind, a really bad idea, because throughout the Christian tradition, those two go hand in hand, I think, in a really, really powerful way.
Okay, so thank you, David. Great summary. Let's do this. Let's go to Christine, and then Andrew had his hand up. And so we'll let Andrew share what he's thinking, and then we want to go to you, Louis, to hear some of your thoughts about this conversation. So we'll go in that order. In the chat box, Christy Richau, however you pronounce your name, Christy, thank you. She put in Philippians 1, 5-8. A great passage that's often been used in this very discussion that David just referred to. The word virtue there is erete in the Greek. So right there in Philippians, Paul is using this Greek word. So, but Chris, and then Robbie, you're going to jump in. You need to jump in now, Robbie?
Well, I just think it might be helpful to identify that, Aquinas actually talks about virtues, gifts, beatitudes, and fruits of the Spirit. So fruits of the Spirit, gifts of the Spirit, beatitude, and virtues. So this is something that Andrew Pinsent writes about in Aquinas in a second person perspective. And it's just worth knowing that even Aquinas distinguishes a little bit between a gift of the Spirit, or a fruit of the Spirit, and virtues. And so does Augustine, I think, and that's okay. Maybe there's a distinction between a virtue and a gift of the Spirit. They're both really good things. So
you're pointing out that language has a kind of natural fluidity and evolution of use too. So that's just another reason to be very careful about saying, well, virtue means this, and so now I've pegged it down. It can't ever be used in another way. Virtue is pagan. It's not Christian. In fact, it's anti-Christian. Now you're starting to move in ways that the word would not allow you to, as we see how it's used throughout history. But Christine brought up a really, I think, important perspective that Flannery O'Connor was the channel for her. That there's a sense in which virtues do fall short. We can say that there's continuity. That David was pointing out, there's continuity. Don't bifurcate. But Christine, why did you think it important to bring up at least one example of a discontinuity? And could you explain what that discontinuity is?
Sure. I mean, Andrew, at the end of his essay, mentions that virtue is its own reward. And I think that, most people in history have agreed that if you are virtuous, you're rewarded. It's what you want as a human being. There's a kind of harmony if you can achieve it. And notice the word achieve, and yet we can't so often. And there's moral damage, there's moral bad luck. There's so many things that get in the way of this. So first, I just want to say, if you can strive to virtue and achieve it, you are much rewarded. It is its own reward. It is its own pleasure. In the prayers that I love, it's often said throughout the service, grant this person their good desires. I mean, like, that's sort of what the human is for, to be, to have these good desires and to achieve them. And yet, one of the things that I love about the Beatitudes and about Andrew's emphasis on the Beatitudes in his essay, and also on really all of the novelists and where the novelists take us on this question, is that there are many, many things in the way. And beatitude, in some sense, has to do not with achievement, not with excellence, but with a kind of receptive shouldering or acceptance of the ways in which we fall short, and life falls short, and those around us fall short. And so I think this is a great tension at the heart of this question of virtue. And I think we talk about it too little when we talk about this. I have a quote from Guardini that I did not include in my essay, but I love. I love his book, Learning the Virtues That Lead Us to God. He says, "But how does God speak with us, and how does he enable us to understand his word and to answer it with ours? His voice and our hearing and answering we call conscience. This is a wonderful thing. Constantly we are touched by the call which comes to us from the good, the right, that which is worthy of being and should be. This good is all inclusive and yet quite simple. It constantly urges us, do me, realize me, carry me into the world so that the kingdom of the good may come into being. And let us assume that a voice within us, our conscience, replies, yes, I will, but how shall I do this? And thereupon follows a silence, for the good is as unlimited in content as it is simple in form, and so it cannot simply be done." And so here we have an author saying, it's not just that there are things in the way, it's that it's so varied and so multiple that there's a sense in which our very personhood, our very being, and the way in which we learn to participate in this process is the answer. So we're talking about it in very abstract terms here, but I just like to look at, some authors like Flannery O'Connor, who says, that ultimately the virtues have to be learned and then they have to be burned away. Or Dostoevsky, who gives us the character of the idiot, who is angelic. People misunderstand this book so much. He's an angelic character. And yet, guess how the book ends? He is lying next to his beloved, whom he tried to marry and redeem. She's dead. And on the other side is her lover, who's stuck a knife between her ribs, and they're all in bed together. And the Mishkin, the guy, the idiot, he keeps thinking the world is better than it is. And he keeps imposing that goodness on others instead of facing what's there and working with it. So I think that it's incredibly complex. I think it's very important to study with students and to create the categories as we're trying to do now, but not just stop with the categories, look at the complexity that the novelists teach us, and that our own lives teach us, because in reality, we're all incredibly separated from this achievement that would make us all very happy if we could achieve it.
Yeah. Could you just go a bit farther? Because you mentioned the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
Blessed are those who mourn. How can that just contradicts Aristotle?
Right.
Aristotle says you need a measure of wealth, a measure of health, and Jesus also says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So I just I know you've thought deeply about this, but maybe you just take one of those Beatitudes for us How can that be a beatitude? How can that be a good thing?
So this is the great mystery of the Christian faith. I think it's also the reconciliation of the virtue tradition. And I think it's very important for us to be able to understand the virtue tradition, the way in which those breadcrumbs were dropped along the path, all the way along throughout human history, throughout human longing. And then to have Christ come on the scene and say, the place where you are weak is the place where you meet me. And that doesn't mean that you don't strive. Thank God there are people striving. Thank God for everyone who strives. You know, I think of even like my surgeons who have striven in their virtue to do the thing they do so well. And it's saved my life for now. So, I mean, I think striving is very good. But there's a place in which our striving reveals our fragility and our weakness. And that's a place where Christ comes to meet us and be near to us. You know, the suffering one, the suffering servant comes and says, here's a place where you can be near to me and learn from me of what it means to achieve a kind of makarios, a kind of happiness, a kind of blessedness that is not the thing that comes from Veer.
Thank you. It's supernatural. And it's a nice way of talking about the distinction between the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and how they actually realize the natural virtues. But now, and it's some of you might not know, Christine has moved through a cancer diagnosis and surgery. And so she has lived through this in some ways that are much more palpable than many of us who just do it by reading. She's had to live this, but haven't we all suffered? So we're all familiar with this. Andrew, we're going to you and then to Louis. What's on your mind, Andrew?
A lot, but I'll keep it as brief as I possibly can. First of all, this conversation is an amazing blessing to me. I'll say to something David said earlier, this is kind of, I'm hoping I'm weaving something together here. But David said earlier, quoting Anselm, I believe in order that I may understand. And I have come to the conclusion that so does everybody else. The only reason a scientist understands the world is because he believes it's there. And for that reason, the person who believes the world is an illusion doesn't do science and doesn't come to understand it. So faith being first is not unique to Christians. That's a condition of all knowledge. It's always first. Faith is always first. And that's not irrational and that's not fideistic for this main point that I want to make, which is that existence, I believe, is analogical. And what I mean by that, or to contextualize that, between the 13th and the 16th century, I believe that the European mind went through a massive transition in a number of different ways. But the easiest and most relevant one to describe for us now is that it went from an analogical mode of being to an analytical mode of being. I think the technical term would be analogia entis, but I'm not sure if that's exactly what I mean. In an analogical world, you and I are not just, we don't just think by using analogies, we are analogies. We are images, and an image is an analogy. We are essentially analogical beings. And so therefore we respond to analogies in a perfectly rational way. That is a rational thing to do. To need a story instead of an argument is rational, right? Because it's analogical, because existence is analogical. And when we dropped that foundation, we still think analogically, but we do it in a utilitarian way. We use analogies to illustrate points, but we don't see existence as fundamentally analogical. Instead, we see it as analytical. And when analytical, of course, means to cut up. So what we've done since then is we've made all thought method, by which I mean, you know, the analytical method. We've divided and fragmented reality, and we're to the point now in the 21st century where we can't have a discussion across parties and we can't deliberate because everything is conflict driven, because that's where analysis goes if it's separated from analogy. Now, the reason I emphasize that here is because Christ is the Logos, and that gives us the analogos, which is where we get analogy. And Christ unites us with the world we live in because of that. So Carrie talked about this, and I forget, Chris, you at least talked about the connection between the world and us, and how we become virtuous in our interactions with the world if we receive it, right? If we resist everything the world is doing to us, we don't become virtuous because we're resisting reality. Okay, and this is why you don't become fully yourself until you take up your cross. You don't become a fully human being until you make a solid choice to reject a whole bunch of good options. Right? If you try to perfect every capacity you have, you won't become virtuous. You'll become a libertine. You'll be what Kierkegaard would call aesthetic. If you make a choice and you live by that choice, you cut off all kinds of possibilities for yourself except for one. You've now created the possibility that you can become ethical. You can become a morally good person. And that is so much better than all the other things, right? Now, the connection to all of that with analogy is to say that the reason for that is because the Logos that is in our spirit and in our soul and in our mind is also in the creation. And so the Logos interacting with the Logos enables a dialogos. And so it's a dialectic between me and the world I live in. And what we use to have that dialectic, that dialogos, is an analogos, a symbol or a sign or a word or a proportion or an equation, right? All of our interactions, all of our thinking is analogical. It's always a model. We always only think in models. But we can know reality with those models because the logos in our mind is also in the world. And so to the question of how do we become virtuous, right? This is the irony for this and the two-tier thing is that it was Plato who pointed out that this is an issue. So if you're going to be a Christian who won't read Plato, you're going to lose a lot of things. You're going to lose a lot of things, clarity on the things you're thinking that he already thought before you, better than you can think it. Because he offered a bunch of options for becoming virtuous. Is it a gift? Can you teach it? Is it done? Do you gain it by experience? Or I forget the options now. I forget all of them. But my suggestion would be it's all of those. It's all of those. So I'm sorry for talking this long because I'm trying to make one single point that ties, I think, all of this together, which is that it is when we, as analogies, that is to say images, receive into our being the analogies of the creation, that is to say parables, the meaning of things, the reality of things, the truth of things, we come alive within ourselves and it's all gift. And yeah, there's an element of striving, but there's much greater element of simply receiving. It's by receiving Logos that we become like the Logos. It's by receiving Christ the Logos that we become sons of God. And it transitions to your question about education. The biggest mistake of modern education is it's hyper-analytical. And analogical thinking is so much simpler, so much more universal, so much more comprehensive, so much more complete, and it takes a very long time, but it enables us to bring order to all thought because Christ is in all things and guides that. So if I can reduce all of this, I hope this was coherent. I really tried to make it coherent. But the simple point that I'm trying to get at is Christ really is the Logos, and it really is union with him that is both goal and means. And he is in the creation and he is in us. And when we receive him, no matter how he comes to us, when we receive him, we are blessed by that. If we receive him as our Savior, it reaches its fulfillment. But he's so humble. That's why parables work. He'll teach us anyway. We can receive him in a math equation. We can receive him in garden work. And when we do that, to the degree that we receive him, we are blessed. We are made virtuous. But if we lose that sense of an analogical cosmos, I think everything quite literally is cut up and fragmented and analyzed, even though I just have to end with this because it's crucial. Analysis is not bad.
Thank you.
The purpose of analysis is to keep us from being really stupid with our analogies, because we are.
Good.
So we need to use it.
Thank you for that, wrapping it up that way, because I was going to go there. Yes, but you did it beautifully at the very end. Then this does, I think, provide a nice segue to Lou and his work. Lou has thought a lot about the way the old classical tradition was subsumed in and transformed by the Christian tradition. And he's also in his essay written about the difference between a virtue-based education and what we see so often in contemporary education. So Lou, give us your summary thoughts and work your essay.
Thanks. This is a great dialogue. This has really got my mind blowing here. Remember, obviously, Aristotle says the chief end is happiness. Augustine kind of agrees with him, but you can't be happy unless you're virtuous. So, I mean, the two really go together. And I told you I was in Boise, Idaho with David Goodman last week, and I was telling him just last week that, I got to read his original book that later became Battle of the American Mind. And I told him that when he said virtue was not a behavior, but a conformity. And now I realize he kind of got that from Andrew. So we're bouncing it around here. I said that really opened up my mind. And when I speak, I say that virtue is not ultimately about do's and don'ts. It's about conforming yourself or aligning yourself with that which is real, that which is true, with the cosmos. So, I'm 61, so I know the unbelievable irony of Carl Sagan calling his show Cosmos when he does not believe that the universe is ordered in any way. So it's kind of like a joke almost. Okay, so we are, and I know it sounds new age to say that virtue is to align ourselves with the cosmos, but we are aligning ourselves with that which is real. The opposite of that is values clarification, which is pretty close to constructivism, where each child constructs their own value system. Well, no, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to bring you into conformity and alignment with that which is real, right? The philosophical definition of realism, not realism like a realistic movie with guts in it, but there are real things up there, and we need to conform ourselves to that, or we'll be cut off from it. Now, I didn't have time to go into it in my essay, but this is something I sort of noticed. And then when I read Nancy Pearcey's The Toxic War on Masculinity, she really did enough research to show that what I always thought was true, that it's only been the last couple hundred years that the word virtue has got a very strong feminine connotation, where in the past it had a very strong masculine connotation. And by the way, that's also true of the word pietas. Pietas means duty. Piety has it. Now, what's the difference? Okay, today we tend to think of virtue in terms of emotion, feeling, empathy. What about the empathy wars? I won't go into that. Empathy and sympathy wars. But before that, it was more about reason and alignment. The reason the Christians were able to bring together the Greco-Roman paideia and the Bible, the scriptures and all that, is partly because of the idea of logos, right? And logos is logic, but it's also reason, but it's also Christ, the ultimate end of everything. Now, I think one of the things that caused us to abandon the rational understanding of virtue and having a more emotional or passionate view, and I'm not against the passions, is because of Kant. So the Enlightenment guy comes along and tells us that virtue is duty. Well, I'm okay with that. That's kind of classical. But then you've got Kant, and he's destroyed, especially white people, by which I mean Northern Europeans, who can't even enjoy their virtue, because Kant tells them that if you're doing charity and you enjoy it, you're no longer virtuous because you're not doing your duty, which is absolutely insane. Which brings us back to what you said. Virtue is its own reward. The more you practice virtue, the more you will enjoy virtue. So we are not only instilling virtue in our students, we're instilling in them the proper way to feel about virtue, so that when you do a virtuous action, you feel good about yourself, not because you're virtue signaling, but because you're coming into alignment with reality. So, and how are you going to have the beatific vision? You know, the difference is, instead of aligning ourselves with abstract forms, the ultimate alignment is with the triune God. Oh, I talked almost as much as Andrew there.
All good. Now, we do want to
That
pivot.
point of comp though was really, really valuable. That was great.
Mhm.
We're going to pivot now, and I'm going to stop moderating
Feeling
so
that
much.
partly from C.S. Lewis as I get everything.
Mhm.
Yes. Martin has raised his hand. We'll let you, glad to let Martin. Gary, you haven't said much. And just feel free to pipe in now. But I also want to say to those on the call, this is a great time to start putting your questions in the Q&A box. So if you've got a question, drop it in, and we're going to turn to Martin now, but we're going to start reading those questions, and I'm going to just throw them to the panel. So the only other prompt I would say is, it's typical. We've been philosophical. We haven't talked a lot about school, classroom, the teacher. We've addressed it in some important ways. But is there anything else you might want to say about? And I'll let you speak to this, Martin, too. Where are you? Martin, what does this have to do with what's going on at the Highlands Latin School?
Oh, well, that wasn't what I was going to say. I'm not prepared to answer that
I know,
question.
but I want you to answer that question anyway.
Okay, so ask it again.
What does all of this discussion we've had have to do with what's going on at Highlands Latin School there in Louisville?
Well, actually, I guess what I was going to say does have to do with that.
Okay.
Because I get confused in discussions like this because so many terms are thrown around, virtue and beatitude and happiness, and I start wondering, wait, what's the relation between those things? And beatitude, of course, is supreme happiness, is what it means. Beatus is happiness, and it's what happen. Beatitude is what happens when you practice the virtues, the powers that make us better human beings, because human beings, like every other creature, are happiest when they become more fully what they are. And we become more fully what we are when we do what we're created to do. And in our case, in the case of all human beings, again, the root of the word virtue, man, we're the one creature created in the image of God. And so acting in accordance with the image of God is what makes us happiest. And the better we do that, the more beatitude we'll have. So that was what I was originally going to say, because I was trying to unconfuse myself.
Thank you.
And then so we try, I think that what you see in a school is that when you're teaching things to students and you're holding up the virtues in what you read, particularly in subjects like history and literature, it makes students happier. I mean, that when they read these stories, that exemplify man at his worst and at his best, but you see him at his best, and you're attracted by that, and you are given good models to practice the virtues. You're given models of virtuous people. A lot of kids don't get that. And I think they're less happy because they don't have that. Our students are happy because they know what it is they know how to be happy. They practice the virtues. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's
Yeah.
keep that in mind as you respond, panel. We'll go to Carrie and then Gary. Yeah, Carrie, anything that you can share about what this has to do with a classroom or a homeschool?
Yes, I was going to address that. As I was thinking through what everybody was saying, and then, what does this actually mean for education? How do we actually go about addressing this with our students in our homeschool in our classroom, I was thinking, you know, in order to know who we fully are, as we've been discussing, kind of the overarching concept of virtue, you know, in order to fulfill our purpose, we have to, you know, first know what they are. We have to be able to share with our students, you know, what is a virtue, what are the virtues, what are different kinds, and, you know, be able to define that and talk about it. And how do we do that? Well, you know, we can discuss it and we can define it, but more importantly, we show them. We have them observe it through many different types, as we've already discussed, that Martin already discussed. We show them, and Andrew, through analogos, we give them stories. We give them nature and creation in order to observe it. And hopefully what will happen is that they come to love it. And when they come to love it even more, then we hope that they practice it as well. And we give them opportunities to continue to observe, to love it, and to practice it. And we encourage and coach them in doing that. And, you know, education and school and that space, I feel like it's kind of the soil. It's the space where we get all those things are played out. And that's what education is. It's that space where it's all played out.
Thank you, Carrie. You're reminding me too that you're saying as much, but we're giving them we're giving them terminology too. We're giving them words for what it means to be excellent and its opposite in every conceivable area. We give them words for what it means to be an excellent student, a virtuous student, and a vicious one, which just reminds me that there's a vocabulary of vice as well as virtue. A number of you made some mention of this. But Gary, let's go to you. What's on your mind? What do you think?
Well, I think like Martin, I'm really trying to keep up a lot with what's being said, and I feel like I'm sort of trying to grasp at like a snowflake in a blizzard kind of feeling. I wonder if some of the anxiety surrounding virtue and its relation to education, I mean, in Plato's Meno, right, raises a lot of these, like, can you even teach it? So if you're going to make, and sort of the arguments there are pretty open-ended, right? And like, well, I don't know. I don't, it doesn't seem like it. For example, there seem to be people who themselves are virtuous, but then they try to teach virtue to their children and fail miserably, right? And then Socrates, I mean, probably the most powerful thing is Socrates himself says he's never had a teacher of virtue. So is he sort of lying, right? Or is he telling the truth, I think, as best he can?
Yeah, and what's the conclusion, Gary? Where does virtue come from?
Well, he gives us a list, right? He's like, well, it could come from the gods, but if it comes from the gods, he says, then it doesn't come with any understanding to it. And I think that's a kind of crucial theological point, right? That if, for example, Zeus is going to make one virtuous, one isn't going to be able to understand or think about virtue. And that might be a kind of theological limitation there, not so much about virtue itself. But yeah, I think he is, Plato is pretty sort of, I don't know at the end of the Meno is at least how I read that. But the idea, so one thing I think about is virtue the chief end of education? Yes, but we might not be able to accomplish it as educators. And that's a kind of strange situation to be in, though I think it's a little like medicine, right? So the chief end of medicine is health. We may not be able to achieve health, right? Though it, you know, like we it seems that we can bring it about in some cases, but not in others. And I do think there is a kind of disanalogy there between in the case of education, right? So sometimes we might try really hard to bring about virtue in students or even in ourselves. and it seems like we fail. I'm not sure how to account for that failure. Maybe it's just an apparent failure. Maybe we've been successful in some deeper way or some non-apparent way. Also, just throw out there one thing to add is there's someone mentioned a passage in Philippians. There's a similar passage in Second Peter, also mentioning arete, excellence. And then there's a passage in First Thessalonians 4, where Paul says to the Thessalonians that they themselves need to be taught by God. He sort of coins a term there, theodidaktos. And some people have thought, well, maybe that's, yes, virtue can be taught, but you know who it's taught by? It's taught by God. And you might think, well,
everything.
that also can be a little unsatisfying, because then you think, well, what, I'm a teacher, what am I doing? I'm just sort of, I don't, sometimes honestly, I don't know what I'm doing as an educator. Doing no harm, in a way, might be sort of the first rule of education, and that given that context.
At least
Can-
one or
Can
two
I
of you
follow up
mentioned-
on one thing Gary just said?
Yeah, sure.
So this point that we maybe can't do it, that's a really important point that I think we need to take seriously. And this goes the whole way back in the tradition. Seneca talks about this. There are lots of thinkers who point out, look, the liberal arts you can't make someone virtuous. These things conduce to virtue, but the educator, there's no way that when the students leave, our schools or the homeschool, that we've somehow accomplished this goal and they are perfectly virtuous human beings. This is a task of a lifetime, and ultimately, again, is directing us toward eternity, where we will be face to face with God. And I want to just like zoom out to 30,000 feet and point out how absolutely crazy this entire conversation is for anyone in like mainstream education. So we're quibbling about the lexical spectrum of Greek and Latin terms, and like, how these terms morph over time, and these thinkers, like, what are we even talking about? Like, if most people would be listening to this, they'd be like, what are you guys even talking about? And now you're saying that the chief goal of your entire paradigm of education is something you can't even do? Like, that's crazy, right? But this is what defines classical education, is this teleology of forming the human being, not transferring information, not, equipping them for a certain job or something, but cultivating a certain kind of human being. So I just want us to, like, we're sort of wallowing in the weeds, but which is really fun and great. But I just want to point out that, like, this entire conversation is one of the most distinctive things about this entire approach to education, because in most educational contexts today, this entire conversation or these questions would just be non-starters.
Thank you,
That's
David.
beautiful,
We're gonna
David.
go-
Thank you.
We're going to go to Ravi and Martin and Catherine. I just will add that we could maybe call this sharpening iron as well as wallowing in the weeds. We are going someplace here, and there's some, and philosophy is one of the most practical things when it comes to life, getting the ideas right. But some of you might be on the call thinking, I'd like to hear more about practices of how you do this, and that's a legitimate question as well. But let's just take a moment here. All of the panelists, would you just take a moment, 30 seconds, and write some books into the chat box? Books that you know that will be helpful for people to read who want to learn more about the virtue tradition and also are thinking about practice. Carrie and I have written The Good Teacher. That's available at Classical Academic Press. Andrew has just written a book last year, Unless the Lord Builds the House. Louis has just finished a book called Passing on the Torch. Martin's always writing, so that, just write down some things that you've written or that you know of that you think might be of helpful. I think that'll be a nice gift to those on the call. And for those of you on the call who've asked, yes, we'll send you a link to the recording. So if you have to go, put someone to bed, you can get the rest of the recording. We're going to you, Ravi, and then Ravi pass it on to Martin, and Martin pass it on to Andrew.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And to the point about practices and what do you do, and I think there's three things that um, that are outcomes of this conversation or distinctives of this conversation about virtue, and that is heart, habits, and right and wrong. So to David's point, I think, and I'm going to take them in reverse order. To David's point, just saying that there's right and wrong in the world, or we have to fit ourselves to the cosmos, is kind of an extraordinary departure from contemporary education. So that's that's a very controversial point right there, and so that's something the virtue tradition says to begin with. But then again, going backwards, habits, so that there are habits that we should cultivate that fit with the right and not with the wrong. And so I think the thing is, we agree with lots of other Christian schools that there is right and wrong out there. And the way we've expressed virtue today is either Christian virtue, or that there's really the classical tradition anticipated virtue in such a way that, the Christians draw classical virtue into Christian thought in a helpful way. So the point is that what are we doing different in classical Christian schools than other Christian schools? And this conversation on virtue, I think there's two other insights that are helpful, and that is habits and heart. One of the things in the virtue tradition is a strong emphasis on habits. Why read Aristotle to talk about virtues? Because he's really clear about the centrality of developing habits from a very young age, and how that helps form character and how it helps form your moral sensibilities. Now, we in the Christian tradition would probably call that sanctification, and that's a kind of a complex relationship between um, union with Christ or becoming a Christian and sanctification. What do you do when they're children? But I think at least that's what we talk about as far as habits go, or spiritual disciplines. So as much as we want to talk about spiritual disciplines and habits and what are we doing as schools, I think that's something about virtues that we want to see that's distinctive about this conversation, the role of habits. But the last thing I wanted to say, and again in reverse order, is the heart. The point of the habits is to reach the heart, and this is also something that I think is really distinct in the virtue conversation from Plato through Cicero, Augustine, Ordo Amoris, Aquinas. Virtue is something you enjoy. Like the reward of virtue is you enjoy it. You enjoy doing the right thing. It's not just doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing and loving it, loving the right thing. So the habits can be a tutor, but they're a tutor for the heart. And so at this one of the most important things I think in this, as far as it matters for educators and education, is how do we think about manners, teaching the students manners or teaching the students habits, or good ways of being with each other, or good institutional practices that set up habits that reach the heart, that are conforming with right and wrong. Because ultimately, it's learning, it's not just doing the good, it's learning to love the good, that is virtue. And that love is really an order towards God. But there's a lot of things that God enjoins us to do, and learning to love all those things, like our neighbors, or those people, is part of God's calling on our lives. So those three things I think are actually kind of helpful for educators: the heart, habits, and right and wrong as distinctive about this virtue conversation.
Thank you, Ravi. Martin.
Yeah, I think we sometimes talk as if in a way that conflates being virtuous and knowing what virtue in the abstract is. I think that's part of the Plato issue, is he's really talking what virtue in the abstract is. But I think we need to ask ourselves a question: do we need to know what virtue in the abstract is in order to be virtuous? And I don't think we do. We like to talk philosophically about virtue, but in a way that's sort of beside the point. We don't have to have any adequate philosophical definition of virtue in order to practice it, in order to be virtuous. We know what virtue is, human beings. We know what virtue is when we see it, and all we have to do is imitate it. And in education, this is the teaching technique that goes along, or the learning technique that goes along with virtue, is simply imitation. You become virtuous by doing what good people do. And that includes obviously Christ. Be like unto Christ. That's the command. And so I think we confuse these two things. I think they're a little confused, and they're often confused in my mind. But I think we were talking about both things here, and I think we need to make a distinction.
Thank you. We're gonna summarize now in like 3 minutes. So we got 3 hands up, Andrew, Louis, and David. So offer your comments and thoughts, but I am then going to close us in about 3 or 4 minutes as we've hit the 90-minute mark.
I'll give you
Go ahead, Andrew.
I'll give you 5 words that I'll then turn into 5 sentences, and then I'll be done. The first word is 2 words, sola magister. The second word is glory. The third word is appreciation. The fourth word is participation. And the fifth word is Hebrews 5:14. So sola magister, that's another sola that we need. Jesus specifically said, I am your only teacher. Call no man teacher. For one is your teacher, Christ. We can't teach anybody anything, not just virtue, but we can be instruments when God teaches, when Christ teaches. Then we can be used to cultivate virtue in children's lives. Other than that, forget it. Second, glory. I agree with what Martin said. We don't need to know virtue. We need to perceive it, because we are created for glory. And when we see glory, we are drawn to it, which is why I fell in love with my wife. Third, appreciation. When you see glory, you appreciate it and should be encouraged. This is very practical. You should encourage your students to express their appreciation for the glories that they see, because if you don't, they will lose the appreciation. Fourth, participation. It's not about thinking about virtue, it's about participating in virtue. And fifth, Hebrews 5:14, which is an astonishing verse, and I would encourage you to look it up.
Thank you, Andrew. Lou.
Just to refer back to an old disputed question, it's kind of obvious, but as classical educators, we actually believe that reading and wrestling with the great books creates virtuous people. It sounds sort of naive in a modern progressive world, but Livy's introduction to his history says we study history for role models, both of virtue and of vice. I tell my students, what would Jesus do? But I also want you to ask, what would Achilles do? What would Odysseus do? What would Antigone do, right? What would Orestes do? And so we do believe, think of Bill Bennett, the Book of Virtues, that we are still believing in these great books as something. When we enter into that dialogue, it challenges us and can help us to seek virtue and avoid vice.
Thank you. Closing comments from anyone. Brief be it, though. David, did you want to say something before we break tonight?
Not really. I think Andrew wrapped it up well.
Thank you. Christine, I saw you had a book in your lap. You want to leave us with a quotation? Okay. Well, then let's just thank everybody for traveling with us. We hope that this was edifying and meaningful. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with people who love education, love Christ, and have read deeply and thought a lot and have taught a lot. I would love to have had any of these folks as a teacher of mine in my past. And, we don't know a number of you who are on the call, but we're just so grateful for your calling and the field that you're working in. We appreciate you, and we are moved and thankful for the time you spent with us tonight. Pray for us as we pray for you. And let me close with a prayer. Christ our God, we thank you for your presence among us. We thank you that you are the teacher always among us who leads us to truth, for you are the truth. And as Andrew said, you are the goal, you are the means. We pray that you would bless those on this call and all of us in our work. We ask it through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thanks for being a part, Chris.
Chris.